Kings chapter 4. 2 Kings chapter 4. What's some one of the things that we need to what we're seeing here, the kind of the 40,000 foot view is just the rebellion and the apostasy of the children of Israel just pulling away. Just it's a slippery slope, when you start chasing after idols and following after the enemy, it's a slow fade. And that's what we're seeing. Of course, the northern kingdom is just completely wicked. Never had a good king. They're just after more and more idols, more and more problems. We went through Ahab and Jezebel. Jezebel's still alive, but Ahab's gone. And now their children are running the roost, running the kingdoms, both of them. Southern kingdom and the northern kingdom. So things are just getting gradually worse. Well, who's on the scene tonight and who we're talking about is the prophets. We went through the prophet Elijah. We saw some amazing things that God did with Elijah. And now we're down to Elisha. So Elijah's passed the torch, so to speak, to Elisha. Now Elisha's the main prophet of Israel, and God works through him to his people. And so tonight we're going to see some cool stories with Elisha and see how God works. But before we get started, I want you to look on the screen with me. And here's a verse from the New Testament that you all know, but it goes well with what I think the Lord wants us to learn tonight. Hebrews 13, verse 2. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for by this some have entertained angels without knowing it. Remember the prisoners, as though in prison with them, and those who are ill-treated, since you yourselves also are in the body. You never know who you're dealing with. That's the point. We always want to represent Christ. Now, one of the struggles is, I think, in the flesh, is we tend to look at this time on earth and put too much emphasis on this time and less emphasis on the time to come. And as Christians that are born again, whole new mindset, a whole new creation, the old has passed away, the new has come. We are you hear preachers for years talk about being kingdom-minded. Our focus should be more on building the kingdom of God, not on building the kingdom of self. And when you're building the kingdom of self, you're less likely to reach out to a stranger. You're less likely to stop what you're doing and lend a hand to someone else, make disciples of other people even. So let's look at a good example tonight in the Old Testament here of someone who did not neglect to show hospitality to strangers and how God blesses that. So look at 2 Kings 4, verse 1. Now a certain woman of the wives of the sons of the prophets cried out to Elisha, "Your servant, my husband, is dead, and you know that your servant feared the Lord, and the creditor has come to take my 2 children to be his slaves." And Elisha said to her, "What shall I do for you? Tell me, what do you have in the house?" And she said, "Your maidservant has nothing in the house except a jar of oil." Then he said, "Go borrow vessels at large for yourself from all your neighbors, even empty vessels, do not get a few. And you shall go in and shut the door behind you and your sons, and pour out into all of these vessels, and you shall set aside what is full." So she went from him and shut the door behind her and her sons. They were bringing the vessels to her, and she poured. When the vessels were full, she said to her son, "Bring me another vessel." And he said to her, "There is not one vessel more." And the oil stopped. Then she came and told the man of God, and he said, "Go, sell the oil and pay your debt, and you and your sons can live on the rest." Now, what's happening here is when the husband died, there's a debt that's owed to people. They, by law, and look on the screen at Leviticus 25:49. And there's a whole list of these detailed laws that God gives to them. I just pulled one verse out to show you. "Or his uncle or his uncle's son may redeem him, or one of his blood relatives from his family may redeem him, or if he prospers, he may redeem himself." So this is what Elisha's helping her to do, okay? She doesn't want to lose her son. She doesn't want them to have to go work off the debt. So she wants to pay her own debt so she can keep her sons. Well, all she has is this little bitty picture of little vase. And so they start bringing in these big vases, and she just keeps filling them up. She just keeps filling them up. It's a miracle that the oil just keeps coming until all of a sudden her son says, "That's it." And then the oil just stopped. And then he says, "Now you can go and pay off your debt, and you get to keep your sons." They had the right to take these boys to work off their debt. That was the law. Even if you had to take someone as a slave, though, you were never to mistreat them. Always be kind to them. And that's one of the things that I want you to, if you went back and studied Leviticus, if you understood what was happening here, you would see that it was always the plan of God and a command to the children of Israel to be kind to people. And we need to remember that today. If you're going to help someone, then do it. Help them. No need to browbeat them over what they've done wrong or any of that. No need to shame them. Just help them. But if you don't want to help them, then don't. But always, if you decide to help people or if you decide not to help people, always show grace and kindness no matter what. Now, how many vessels would you have gathered? If you knew this was happening, now let's turn this picture of how many physical vessels would you have gathered if you're trusting in God to give you what you need. What do you really expect from God in your life? It's the same lesson we got last week on digging the trenches, right? What were you really expecting from God? What are you really asking God for? And we learned last week, don't just give up on asking God for something. If you're truly kingdom-minded, if you're truly wanting to do everything that Jesus Christ wants you to do, the first thing you notice is what? It's a daunting task. It's a big job. So why would you ask God for little tools or a little help to do big jobs? Sometimes we don't get what we want or don't get what we need because we don't ask rightly. If our hearts and our motives are right, if we're asking rightly, God will show us, just like He did this lady here with the oil, that He can provide far more, abundantly more than we could ever ask or think. That's what the Scripture says, right? So there's one little miracle right there, an example of trusting God, and God provided all that they needed. Now let's look at the next one, verse 8. We talk about the Shunammite woman. Now there came a day when Elisha passed over to Shunem, where there was a prominent woman, and she persuaded him to eat food. And so it was, as often as he passed by, he turned in there to eat food. She said to her husband, "Behold now, I perceive that this is a holy man of God passing by us continually. Please let us make a little walled-up chamber, and let us set a bed for him there, and a table and a chair and a lampstand, and it shall be, when he comes to us, that he can turn in there." One day he came there and turned into the upper chamber and rested. Then he said to Gehazi his servant, "Call this Shunammite." And when he had called her, she stood before him. He said to him, "Say now to her, Behold, you have been careful for us with all this care. What can I do for you? Would you be spoken for to the king or to the captain of the army?" And she answered, "I live among my own people." So he said, "What then is to be done for her?" And Gehazi answered, "Truly she has no son, and her husband is old." He said, "Call her." When he had called her, she stood in the doorway. Then he said, "At this season next year you will embrace a son." And she said, "No, my lord, O man of God, do not lie to your maidservant." The woman conceived and bore a son at that season the next year, as Elisha had said to her. Now, when you look at the beginning there, Elisha's just passing through town, right? He doesn't ask the lady for anything, does he? He's just passing through. And what does she notice? The stranger coming through. He's probably hungry. Let me offer him something to eat. And then as he began to come more often, she started noticing, as people would notice when someone's coming through, and she says that he's a holy man of God. This is a lesson that everybody should always be looking to feed the preacher. I know, man, it's a hard crowd tonight. You're supposed to always set up, you know. See, like Miss Wanda, she always brings me stuff to eat. She used to. She's been backsliding a little bit lately. But this lady Elisha didn't ask her for anything, right? She just notices in her heart that this man is traveling. He probably would enjoy a nice meal. And then she went on above and beyond. Not just a meal, but let's build a place for him to rest. It's hard walking those dusty roads back then, you know. And so Elisha recognizes the goodness of her heart. So he wants to know how he can help her. She doesn't need an army. You know, she doesn't need the king. She's not asking for anything. But he finds out the one thing that she didn't have, the greatest joy to a woman was a son, right? She never had a son, and her husband was old. So she's already embraced the fact that I'm just going to live my days and never have a son. And so she went above and beyond for the prophet of God, and God went above and beyond for her. Don't you like that? What a neat little... I love to see the interaction of God there. You know that God's like, what a good heart that lady had, and I'm going to bless her far more. All the prophet got was food and a place to rest, but she got the greatest joy in her life, a son. Now, look what happens, verse 18. When the child was grown, the day came that he went out to his father, to the reapers. He said to his father, my head, my head. Something's wrong. And he said to his servant, carry him to his mother. And when he had taken him and brought him to his mother, he sat on her lap until noon, and then he died. She went up and laid him on the bed of the man of God and shut the door behind him and went out. So he's a small child. She carried him up and laid him on Elisha's bed, the room that they had made for Elisha, and shut the door behind him and went out. Then she called to her husband and said, please send me one of the servants and one of the donkeys, that I may run to the man of God and return. He said, why will you go to him today? It is neither new moon nor Sabbath. And she said, it will be well. In other words, I got this. You don't need to know all the details. Just get me a donkey. I got to go see the preacher. Then she saddled a donkey and said to her servant, drive and go forward. Do not slow down the pace for me unless I tell you. So she went and came to the man of God to Mount Carmel. When the man of God saw her at a distance, he said to Gehazi his servant, behold, there's the Shunammite. Please run now to meet her and say to her, is it well with you? Is it well with your husband? Is it well with the child? And she answered, it is well. See, Elisha doesn't know what's going on. Normally God would tell him, but he doesn't know. He just sees her coming. So he assumes something's wrong. Verse 27, when she came to the man of God to the hill, she caught hold of his feet. And Gehazi came near to push her away, but the man of God said, let her alone, for her soul is troubled within her. And the Lord has hidden it from me and has not told me. Then she said, did I ask for a son from my Lord? Did I not say, do not deceive me? See, she's upset. Why would you give me this child and then take it away? What have you done? Then he said to Gehazi, gird up your loins, take my staff in your hand, and go your way. If you meet any man, do not salute him. And if anyone salutes you, do not answer him. And lay my staff on the lad's face. He means, hurry up, you run with my staff, go to this boy, to where he's at. The mother of the lad said, as the Lord lives and as you yourself live, I will not leave you. And he arose and followed her. Then Gehazi passed on before them and laid the staff on the lad's face, but there was no sound or response. So he returned to meet him and told him, the lad is not awakened. When Elisha came into the house, behold, the lad was dead and laid on his bed. So he entered and shut the door behind them both and prayed to the Lord. Now, do you remember where he might have learned that from? Remember when Elijah raised the widow at Zarephath, raised her son up? So he shuts the door and he prays to the Lord. Verse 34, and he went up and lay on the child, and he put his mouth on his mouth and his eyes on his eyes and his hands on his hands. And he stretched himself on him, and the flesh of the child became warm. Then he returned and walked in the house once back and forth, and went up and stretched himself on him. And the lad sneezed 7 times, and the lad opened his eyes. He called Gehazi and said, call this Shunammite. So he called her, and when she came into him, he said, take up your son. Then she went in and fell at his feet, and bowed herself to the ground, and she took up her son and went out. Now remember the area that this woman is in. They don't care anything about God anymore. They don't care anything about a prophet anymore, right? We've done learned that in the past several lessons. So this is a big deal for her to see that God is still what? God is still concerned for his people. God is still there. He is real. And he has performed these miracles. And she saw it firsthand. Now, let's look at the next one. Verse 38, when Elisha returned to Gilgal, there was a famine in the land. As the sons of the prophets were sitting before him, he said to his servant, put on the large pot and boil stew for the sons of the prophets. Then one went out into the field to gather herbs and found a wild vine and gathered from it his lap full of wild gourds, and came and sliced them into the pot of stew, for they did not know what they were. So they poured it out for the men to eat. And as they were eating of the stew, they cried out and said, O man of God, there is death in the pot. And they were unable to eat. See, that's proof right there that anything that grows on a vine, we should not eat in a stew. Should never be any peas or beans or anything like that put in a stew. Should only be meat. Too, right? Now, these gourds that they're talking about, I looked this up. They were probably what they call colocynth. You ever heard of that word? I hadn't either. Colocynth. Properly called today wild cucumber. The vine still grows near the Dead Sea. When the gourds are cut open, the pulp dries rapidly and forms a powder, which in that part of the world is still used as a cathartic medicine. It has a very bitter taste. If eaten in enough quantity, it induces colic and can be fatal. So that's what they're saying. There was this bitterness. These things had gotten dried out and bitter, and they put it in the soup, and the men noticed it and said it's full of death. And they were unable to eat it. Now, listen to what Spurgeon says about this. He makes a spiritual, I thought was pretty good, a spiritual lesson on this. You have been trying to find pleasure in the world, and you have found wild vines. You have gathered wild gourds, a lapful, almost a heartful. You have been shredding death into the pot, and now you cannot feel as you used to feel. The poison is stupefying your soul. While we were singing just now, you said, I want to sing as saints do, but there is no praise in me. If you are a worldling and not God's child, you can live on that which would poison a Christian. But if you are a child of God, you will cry out, O thou man of God, there is death in the pot. I thought that was pretty good. He says, you have been shredding death into the pot. The little things that we bring into our life. What do we know about how it just sneaks in, right? It's remember me telling you the story about the poop and the brownies? All right, I need a show of hands. I know you don't, but raise your hand if you know the poop and the brownie story. All right, so there's enough that don't know it that I'm going to tell it again. So a father, his two teenage boys want to go to a movie. And he says, well, what kind of movie is it? And they said, Dad, it's got a few little cuss words. It's got one little bad scene in it. But, he said, what's it rated? He said, rated R. Well, the rule was, just like it was with my kids, no rated R movies. And they said, Dad, but it's only got just a few bad words in it and one little bad scene. But that's it. We'll close our eyes. You know what kids say. We won't look. And the dad said, no, boys, you're not going. You know my rule. So they did what most boys did. They what? They pouted. They didn't get their way, so they mope around the house. Their lips fall down. So the dad decides to cheer the boys up. He goes to make them some brownies. Because he knows boys love brownies, right? They love something to eat. So he makes these brownies, and then he takes cat poop and puts just a little pinch of cat poop in the brownie mix. Stirs it up, makes the brownies. He comes to the boys. He says, boys, I know you're sad. You're upset with Daddy. I wanted to make you some brownies. Boy, they've been smelling those brownies cooking, right? So he goes to hand it to him. He says, now, before you eat that brownie, I got to tell you, I put a little bit of cat poop in the brownies. And they were like, what? He said, but boys, look, it's just a little bit. It's not much. You won't even notice it. Just a little bitty bit. See what happens when you let a little bit of something come into your life? That's what he's talking about. It's like poisoning the whole pot of stew. Now look at verse 41. But he said, now bring meal. He threw it into the pot and said, pour it out for the people that they may eat. Then there was no harm in the pot. Now you know that the meal didn't take away the poison, but this is a miracle. God's just he's showing these men that Elisha's come in and he's performed this miracle for them. Listen to this. Commentator said, there is death in the pot. How is the church to meet it? I believe it is to imitate Elisha. We need not attempt to get the wild gourds out of the pot. They are cut too small and are too cunningly mixed up. They have entered too closely into the whole mass of teaching to be removed. Who shall extract the leaven from the leavened loaf? What then? We must look to God for help and use the means indicated here. Bring meal, good, wholesome food was cast into the poisonous stuff, and by God's gracious working, it killed the poison. And the church must cast the blessed gospel of the grace of God into the poison pottage, and false doctrine will not be able to destroy men's souls as it now does. You know where my mind went to? It went to Matthew 13:27. Look on the screen at this, Matthew 13:27. The slaves of the landowner came and said to him, Sir, did you not sow good seed in your field? How then does it have tares, weeds? And he said to them, And the enemy has done this. The slave said to him, Do you want us then to go and gather them up? But he said, No, for while you are gathering up the tares, you may uproot the wheat with them. Allow both to grow together until the harvest. And in the time of the harvest, I will say to the reapers, First gather up the tares and bind them in bundles to burn them up, but gather the wheat into my barn. Do you see what Jesus is saying there? You know, we also know the lesson that a little leaven leavens the whole lump. You let a little bit of poison come into the church. You let false teaching come into the church. You let these things happen. Sin come into the church, and look what happens. It leavens the whole bunch. It messes up the whole pot. But you bring in the gospel of the grace of God. You bring in the truth. You stand on God's promises. You teach the truth of God. And that's where you see that it takes the poison out. It's just the opposite. But yet their lesson there to us is the enemy's always at work while we're here on this earth. He's always going to be trying to come into the church. He's going to be bringing different people in to try to disrupt the church. And we can't know. We can't see all of that all the time. But he said, don't go around trying to pull everybody out, right? God knows what He's doing. God knows who are His, and He knows who are not His. If you don't belong to the Lord Jesus, it'll show up in your life. You will have no concern for the Bible. You'll have no concern for the church. You have no thought of what happens when you die. You just live for now. And as long as that's your mindset, then that's pretty much a telltale sign that you're not born again. And you're going to suffer the consequences of that. Now look at the next one. Now a man came from Baal-Shalishah and brought the man of God bread of the first fruits, 20 loaves of barley and fresh ears of grain in his sack. And he said, Give them to the people that they may eat. His attendant said, What? Will I set this before 100 men? 20 loaves of barley and fresh ears of grain for 100 men? But he said, Give them to the people that they may eat. For thus says the Lord, They shall eat and have some left over. So he set it before them, and they ate and had some left over, according to the word of the Lord. Can you see why God puts this lessons right here in 2 Kings 4? After all that we've been seeing about the apostasy in Israel, the wickedness in Israel, and all the problems, remember when the king there, Jehoram, would not go and seek after the prophet to find out what to do? They'd already turned their backs on God. So God comes in a swoop. It's like, here, look here, I'm going to give you these boom, boom, boom. I'm going to give you these stories to show you who I am, to show you that I'm still God, and I'm still on the throne, and I'm still in charge. All of this food, when this man come into town, that food, the first fruits under the law, if they were still following God, if they were still following the law, that was supposed to go to the priest. It wasn't supposed to go to the men. It was supposed to go to the priest. Look on the screen at Numbers 18. All the best of the fresh oil and all the best of the fresh wine and of the grain, the first fruits of those which they give to the Lord, I give them to you. The first ripe fruits of all that is in their land, which they bring to the Lord, shall be yours. Every one of your household who is clean may eat it. So see, this is another example, as we've gone through this tonight, of how the children of Israel had no concern for what God had established for them. They had forgotten their own laws. They were not living by them. And he says there, I thought it was pretty cool when he said, you expect me to set this small amount of meal in front of 100 men? It won't even come close to feeding them. There's no way. What does that remind you of? And I want to read this to you in closing. Matthew 14. Matthew 14. Some of you may not have heard this story, so I'm closing with this. If y'all never heard this story, listen to this. Now when Jesus heard about John, talking about John the Baptist, he withdrew from there in a boat to a secluded place by himself. And when the people heard of this, they followed him on foot from the cities. When he went ashore, he saw a large crowd, and he felt compassion for them, and healed their sick. When it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This place is desolate, and the hour is already late, so send the crowds away, that they may go into the villages and buy food for themselves." But Jesus said to them, "They do not need to go away. You give them something to eat." They said to him, "We have here only 5 loaves and 2 fish." And he said, "Bring them here to me." Ordering the people to sit down on the grass, he took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up toward heaven, he blessed the food. And breaking the loaves, he gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds, and they all ate and were satisfied. They picked up what was left over of the broken pieces, 12 full baskets, the number of the disciples. There were about, now listen to who's in the crowd. Remember, 5 loaves of bread and 2 fishes. And the Bible says there were about 5,000 men who ate, besides women and children. So if every man had 1 wife, that's how many? That's 10,000 people. And if every couple had 1 child, that's 15,000 people. And what if they had more? You see what the numbers could be? So with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fishes, Jesus fed at least 15,000 people. Or at least, somewhere in the thousands, right? You wouldn't think that 5 loaves and 2 fishes would feed but 5 people maybe. But he said that. God is showing this apostate people, again, that I'm still here. You have no reason. Here's what I thought. You have no reason to chase after these other gods, these false gods. I have always provided all that you needed. When you come out of Egypt, what did he show them? He proved to them. He provided them water that came out of a rock. He provided the manna from heaven and fed those people. And he led them across the wilderness, but he always provided for them. But what? They kept wanting more. They kept wanting more. What's a lesson for us tonight? Several lessons there for us tonight. I'm curious. You can go ahead and turn us off, Josh.